The Hemingway Odyssey began here. It was in this house that Ernest Hemingway was born and spent his first 6 years. Although books and articles about his life and work continue to pour out decades after his death, there is much about him that remains a mystery. He almost never spoke about his years as a child in this house. That is unfortunate. Our understanding of him would gain enormously if we could see through his eyes his experiences in those formative years. What did Hemingway see, hear, and learn here in the first 6 years of his life? How was he affected by his experiences? What were his relationships then with his mother and father and grandparents? Let's look for answers to these and other questions by playing a game. Let's pretend. What if Hemingway had been born on the other side of Oak Park Avenue and had lived his first 6 years in the home of his grandfather Hemingway rather than in the home of his grandfather Hall? The house across the street at 444 North Oak Park Avenue was the home of Anson Hemingway, Ernest's paternal grandfather. It was in that house that Ernest's father, Clarence Edmonds Hemingway, grew to manhood, and from here that he first practiced medicine. Dr. Ed, as he was known to his colleagues and friends, had a patient on the other side of Oak Park Avenue at number 439, the house we are in. The patient, Caroline Hall, was suffering from terminal cancer. Upon Caroline's death, the house was left in charge of her daughter, Grace. Grace and Dr. Ed had been in the same class at Oak Park High School, but were not attracted to each other then. She remembered him at that time as a skinny boy whose arms were too long for his jacket sleeves. But at some point, they began dating, and by the time he was in med school, they were corresponding with each other. Grace's feeling for the young doctor was strengthened during her mother's final illness. His frequent visits, his genuine concern for her mother, endeared him to Grace. After her mother's death, she went to New York City for a year of study in grand opera. Although she possessed a remarkable contralto voice and an operatic career open before her, Grace found in her debut at Madison Square Garden that the stage footlights pained her eyes unbearably. So, after a trip to Europe, she returned to Oak Park to marry Dr. Ed and combine a career of teaching music with the raising of their children. For the newlyweds to live in Grace's home seemed a logical living arrangement, and so the doctor moved to the other side of Oak Park Avenue from the house of his father to that of hers. Marceline, their first child, was born in 1898, and Ernest on the morning of July 21, 1899. The bedroom may be seen upstairs. Local legend says that Dr. Hemingway was so elated at the birth of a son that he stepped out to the front porch and blew a salute on his cornet to announce the event to the world. At first glance, it would seem to matter but little on which side of the street Ernest was born, in which grandfather's house he spent his formative first 6 years. Both houses were spacious, both proclaimed prosperity and stability. The two houses were equally capable of giving him shelter and security. The lives of Hemingway's grandfathers, likewise, were markedly similar. The two men were born within 4 years of each other, Ernest Hall, whom we see here, in 1840, and Anson Hemingway in 1844. Both were of English ancestry, as were the wives to whom they were happily married, and each survived his wife. Both men were pillars of the Oak Park community, upholders of traditional ethical values and standards of conduct, men who had prospered as successful salesmen. Hall as partner in a wholesale cutlery firm in Chicago, and Hemingway, shown here, in Oak Park real estate. At the time of Ernest's birth, Hall had retired except to watch over his investments, but grandfather Hemingway still was active in business. Both men were devout Christians who carried religious observances into their daily lives. Grace was said before meals, and family worship in both homes was customary. They were good men, upright, moral, cast in the Victorian Oak Park mold, and wasps by definition, but admirable by almost any standard in any age. There were differences between the two, of course, and the more closely one looks at their lives, the greater the differences loom. In religion, Anson Hemingway was a member of the First Congregational Church, shown here. His was a stern New Testament God who frowned on drinking, dancing, card-playing, and the use of tobacco. God's word could be found in the Bible, and Anson Hemingway wrote often in his Civil War diaries of going alone to the woods on Sundays outside his army encampments to read from his Bible and ponder its meaning. Ernest Hall's Episcopal faith was less confining, warmer, and more personal than that of Hemingway. It permitted him to enjoy a pipeful of tobacco in the family library each evening after dinner. Ernest's sister Marceline describes vividly their grandfather Hall's daily religious service in the parlor. After reading a selection from Daily Strength for Daily Needs, he knelt, not with head bowed, eyes closed, and solemn face, but smiling with face and eyes turned upward. In her words, "I liked to watch grandfather through my fingers because he seemed so surely to be talking to his friend God." Ernest Hemingway was present at these daily ceremonies. He could scarcely have been unaffected by them. Throughout his adult life, Hemingway sought to reach religious certainty. Perhaps he was prompted in this search by the example of his grandfathers. And we may wonder whether the idea of a code of conduct, which marked Hemingway's life and guided the actions of his fictional heroes, may not have stemmed from the code by which his grandfathers lived. Although Ernest's grandfathers both volunteered for military service in the Civil War, they came to have completely different attitudes toward the war. Anson Hemingway seems not to have disliked military service. In fact, he stayed in the Army for nearly a year after the war was over. In peacetime, he enjoyed reminiscing with other veterans as he read from his diaries or attended reunions of his comrades or spoke at local schools about the war or took part in Memorial Day parades. In a picture taken just before one such parade, Ernest posed third from our left, near his uniformed grandfather, apparently playing a fife. The marching, the flags, the martial music, and the stories told by grandfather Hemingway may have inspired a drawing Ernest later made in elementary school. Ernest's lifelong fascination with war was shown in his own involvements and in his writings, from A Farewell to Arms to For Whom the Bell Tolls. Ernest Hall served in the Union cavalry for less than a year and apparently had an unhappy time of it. Afterwards, he would not allow mention of the war in his presence. Clearly, he is not the grandfather who determined Ernest's attitude toward war. Ernest Hall spoke proudly of his new son-in-law as the blessed doctor, and the affection was mutual. Dr. Hemingway referred to Mr. Hall as a second father, and he took seriously his duty to be a proper father to Ernest. The doctor could be a stern taskmaster administering physical punishment, but he was a teacher and companion as well, opening the outdoor world to Ernest's eyes. He allowed Ernest to fire a rifle at the age of 2.5 and at 4 to fire a pistol. The doctor trained Ernest to observe what they saw on their walks together, to look for and remember the secrets of nature. Art and music held center court in the Hall household. Mrs. Hall, Caroline, drew and painted. Although she had died 4 years before Ernest was born, her paintings remained on display in the Hall home. Shown here are pencil sketches of hers from the Historical Society of Dyersville, Iowa, where Caroline and Ernest Hall were married. Perhaps the artwork predisposed Ernest to an interest in the artistic movements he later encountered in Paris, movements which profoundly influenced his writing. Music was as natural as breathing at the Halls. Grace, Ernest's mother, dutifully followed her mother's advice to stay out of the kitchen, devoting herself to her music and, in time, to the raising of Ernest and her other 5 children. Ernest could scarcely have avoided the sound of music during his first 6 years, as his mother gave voice lessons to many pupils and played piano and her mother's melodeon and sang for the enjoyment of her family. All family members attended the opera. Ernest Hall's interest in music was as keen as that of his wife and daughter, and enriched the musical heritage of his famous grandson. It is tempting to suggest that the rhythms and the prose of Ernest Hemingway, to say nothing of his poems, derive in part from the music in his early environment and perhaps in his genetic inheritance. The home of Anson and Adelaide Hemingway did not warm to youthful self-expression. Ernest's cousin Isabel Hemingway wrote some time ago that she had stayed in Anson Hemingway's home when she was young, and that it was a place where, quote, children were to be seen and not heard. Ernest Hall, on the other hand, admired and encouraged Ernest's imagination. He made up a series of stories for the enjoyment of his grandchildren about the adventures of a pack of small dogs. Ernest, caught up in the stories, for a time insisted that he be called Carlo with Fiery Eyes, the name of one of the dogs, and he made up a story of his own in which he was the hero. He had saved a lady's life, he reported, by stopping her runaway horse on the street. Mr. Hall's reaction? He said on several occasions that with Ernest's energy and imagination, the world would hear of him someday. Did Ernest Hemingway come from a loving family? Perhaps an answer can be found in the 5 large, detailed memory books, now at the JFK Library in Boston, which his mother kept for him. Let us look at Ernest's record through the eyes of his mother. Here are a few samples of her many entries as she observed her son's development in the Hall home. At 1 week old, he responded to a nursery rhyme, Robin the Bobbin, and would stop crying for it every time. At 2.5 months, he would sing continuously when told. He liked hearing his father on the cornet. On July 27, just after his first birthday, he had 18 words in his vocabulary. He likes to play walk ride with his grandfather, a game invented by Mr. Hall, which is a much stamping run. At 19 months, Grace listed 24 birds he can name when he sees their pictures. At a little past 2, he says to his mother, after she had sung the hymn Onward, Christian Soldiers, "Tweety, oh Tweety, when I det to be a big boy, I dant to be a onward Christian soldier." He is very tender-hearted and cried bitterly over the death of a fly and tried to revive it with sugar and water. At 2 years, 7 months, he made his first book with the help of his mother. A copy of this treasure, which surfaced in 1993, is shown elsewhere in this house. The original is in the possession of the Sanford family, descendants of Ernest's sister Marceline. Let us look at the book, Ernest Hemingway's First, in detail. It was made of sheets of letter paper, 8.5 by 11, folded to make pages 8.5 by 5.5. The cover reads, "Ernest Miller made this book all himself, illustrated it, and named all his drawings at 2 years, 7 months, March 8, 1902. How shall we interpret this book and its drawings? What do they mean? His drawings, with his mother's notations, appear in this order. Pipe. Is this a reference to Mr. Hall's after-dinner pipe? Giraffe. Was Ernest taken on a visit to the zoo, or one of the traveling circuses which visited Oak Park? Was he thus predisposed to later adventures in Africa? Noah's Ark with animals in it. Does this reflect his early religious training? Sailing in the sea. Do we have here a preview of his later love affair with the Gulf Stream, or a reflection of stories he heard from his great-grandfather Hancock's sailing around the world? Man in the Moon. Is this a reflection of his grandmother Hemingway's talks on astronomy? Bow and arrow. Is this a reference to his father's collection of Indian arrowheads and other artifacts, or of Indians Ernest was coming to know in his summers at Walloon Lake in Michigan? 2 guns. Ernest had already been allowed to fire a rifle, as we said. And on the back of the book is its validation, with Dr. Hemingway's letterhead giving the Hall address at 439 North Oak Park Avenue. The book tells us much of the past and the future. The past, of the teaching, the experiences, and materials which had been given to Ernest at the home of his grandfather and his response to him. The future, the fascination even at 2 years and 7 months with books and the relationship of ideas and words and images which would illuminate his life's work. Returning to the memory books kept for Ernest by his mother, at 2 years, 8 months, counted up to 30 for his grandfather Hall and uttered his first complete sentence, "I don't know, Buffalo Bill." When asked what she is afraid of, he shouts out, "Afraid of nothing," with great gusto. He delights in shooting imaginary wolves, bears, lions, and buffalo. His birthday present at 4 was an all-day fishing trip with his father. At 4 years, 3 months, on a 3-mile walk with his mother, he says, "Mama, I know why people die. It's to keep God company. He gets lonesome." He enjoys the stories his Uncle Tyler Hancock tells about his adventures on sales trips. At 4, his mother dressed him like a girl as he and Marceline took their little sister Ursula for a ride in her buggy. A year later, the 3 enjoyed lemonade on the front lawn of the Hall home. Having been given a microscope by his grandfather Hall, he is delighted to look at specimens of rocks and insects by the hour. In the summer of 1904, Mr. Hall made his last visit to Windermere, the Hemingway cottage on Walloon Lake in Michigan. Ever the English gentleman, he wore jacket and tie in the North Woods for a picture with his grandchildren. Here in the memory book from the spring of 1905 is Ernest's last valentine from his grandfather Hall. "O comrade brave from Windermere, the squirrels are thinking it is so queer, you're leaving them so long alone, just call them up on the telephone." Let's repeat this. Listen to what it tells us about the relationship between Ernest and his grandfather Hall. "O comrade brave from Windermere, the squirrels are thinking it is so queer, you're leaving them so long alone, just call them up on the telephone." Here, in tone and content, is a tiny sample of the world of imagination, of fun, of pleasure in words, which had been imprinted on the mind of Ernest Hemingway by his grandfather. Ernest Hall died on May 10, 1905, of Bright's disease after a lingering illness. Ernest Hemingway had lived in his home for 5 years and nearly 10 months. The house would now be sold, and Grace used her inheritance to build a new home on Kenilworth Avenue. Ernest and his sisters were allowed brief visits to their grandfather Hall's room in his final weeks, and his funeral was held in the parlor. Thus Ernest had his first close experience with death, a theme which would run like a somber thread through the tapestry of his adult life. Grace pasted in Ernest's memory book a picture of the parlor at 439 North Oak Park Avenue, which Ernest now would leave forever. If Ernest Hemingway had lived across the street, he would have been trained in the moral code which guided the 6 successful children of Anson Hemingway. Ernest's grandmother Hemingway would have encouraged him to observe the wonders of nature. But these things he learned from his father. In addition, he received in the household of his grandfather Hall a rich admixture of love, familiarity with the arts, and encouragement to try new things. A child's experiences in the first 6 years of life are of critical importance in his or her later development. This has been borne out by the success of Head Start programs and other recent studies in child psychology, all of which point in the same way. So it is of more than passing interest to note that for Ernest Hemingway, his grandfather Hall's house was a secure, happy, nurturing place, filled with music and fun and warmth, a wonderful place to grow in. The Hall home symbolizes the genesis not only of the physical Hemingway, but also of the insight, imagination, creativity, and artistry, which made him one of the foremost literary figures of his age.